Well, glad to be with you all, and I want to talk to you today a little bit about the sort of national situation facing us, how that's playing out in our metropolitan areas. The title here, State of Disunion, is deliberate, having to do with the fact that we're a changing country, but we've become an incredibly divided country. I don't want to romanticize the past. There's always been division, but the level of polarization, including about what is real and what is not, is at what seems like an all-time high. So I want to talk a little bit about how we got here and maybe some path to get out and why it's important to be doing this at a metropolitan level. If some of you are checking your phones to make sure that democracy has not ended, or that a missile has not been lobbed to us, that's absolutely fine. I sort of understand it. I want to check my phone too. But let me try to get through this. I always like to let audiences know before I start talking much that while I'm talking, my voice might tire or break a little bit. And you might think that it's emotion at being at the 17th annual Smart Growth Conference. Because I mean, what could be better, right? Yes, I am sort of choked up being here. You're so smart and you're so growthy. But it's actually that I have a speech disorder that's called spasmodic dysphonia, spasms around the voice box. Diane Rehm has it, or had it, famous news journalist, now me. And I always like to reassure audiences that it gets treated, and this is true, once a month with Botox. Because that's how we treat everything in Los Angeles, and it's sort of something that really works for us. So you know, there's a couple of big background trends that set the both context for the work around growth and equity and the necessity of lifting up the questions of race and racism that Glenn is talking about. And one, of course, has to do with the changing demography of the country. It's now projected that the US will become so-called majority minority, majority people of color, by about the year 2043, 2044. About 10 years before that, the majority of the workforce, I didn't say new entrants into the workforce, the majority of the workforce will be people of color. And by the end of this decade, the majority of young people will be kids of color. So the country is changing dramatically, and of course there's been very different reactions to that. In a place like Los Angeles, where the future has already arrived, all we can think about that future is, wow, Korean taco trucks, that's gonna be great. For others, there's a tremendous sense of anxiety and unease about that changing demography. There's a lot of misinformation as well. So if you were paying attention during the 2016 election, something you probably should not have been doing, because elections tend to be a fact-free season, you would have thought, and you would have thought from the State of the Union speech last night, or 2 nights ago, that what's driving the demographic change in the United States is immigration. That is no longer true. Immigration into the country has stabilized. Immigration from Asia is now outpacing immigration from Latin America. Immigration from our largest traditional sending country, Mexico, is now net negative. There's more Mexicans returning to Mexico than coming to the United States, something that's likely to continue into the future because the Mexican economy has been doing better and the wage differentials have closed, and also because the fertility rates in Mexico, which used to be at about 5 or 6 children per woman about 35 years ago, are now 2.3 is the fertility rate. In the United States, that's 1.7. As those two come together, less push factors into the future. Most demographers and economists are worried not about too many immigrants, but about too few immigrants in the future. And again, more Mexicans returning to Mexico than coming to the United States, which means, by the way, that if we build a wall, we're just penning Mexicans in, which I'm sure is pretty much not the intention. There's one other aspect about this, which I want to say, and then I want to talk about what's really driving the demographic change, which is really fascinating. If you ask the question geographically, with some exceptions like Arizona, which we'll talk about later, if you ask the question geographically, who is the most concerned about immigrants? What parts of the country are just really anxious about immigrants? They have almost no immigrants. And the places that have a lot of immigrants, like California, which has 1/4 of the nation's undocumented, slightly larger share of all of the immigrants, are kind of, what's the problem, right? Why can't we come to a path to legalization for those who are already here? So what is driving the demographic change? It's really no longer immigration. It's the change in the US youth population. This shows you between 2000 and 2016. For example, in the United States, the number of young whites actually fell by 6.5 million. Now, that does not mean that 6.5 million white young people died. We would have noticed that. There would have been a severe shortage of hipsters, and they would have been affected coffee shops all over the United States. But that means that there's more young whites moving into sort of 19 and 20 than moving into 1 and 2. Number of young African Americans has actually fallen. Some of that is redesignation into the multiracial or other category, which you can see has gone up quite a bit. The big growth, 6 million new young Latinos, about 1 million young Asian Pacific Islanders. So that demographic change is actually sort of baked in. Even if immigration stops, and it won't, that demographic change, that transformation will continue to occur. So shifting demographics, and it's caused a kind of level of racial anxiety in some parts of the country. The other thing that's gone on, of course, is this was very important in the election, economic uncertainty and economic inequality. This shows you the blue line is the share of income going to the top 1%. And you can see that it was very high in the 19-teens and 1920s. In fact, the previous peak was 1928, the year before the Great Depression. The next peak is 2007, the year before the Great Recession. But you can see from about the 80s onwards, moving up, the share of income going to the top 1% has gone up dramatically. The top 1% has run away from the rest of us, and they're, with this new tax law, going to run even further away. Now, that's a big issue, and it's reflected in CEO corporate pay. For example, in the 1960s, the average CEO made about 20 or 30 times what the average worker in his firm made. Now the average CEO makes about 300 to 350 times what the average worker in his or her firm makes. So that's been a big way in which the 1% have run away from the rest. But even beneath that, there's a sort of sense of inequality below the 1% for those who are simply in the labor market. This is what's happened for full-time year-round workers at different points on the sort of wage distribution. So for people in the 90th decile, that means there's 10% folks make more, 90% make less, 80th, 20, 80, not 50th is the median, and then below that. And you can see that in the United States, the gray bars, and in the California, it's been kind of on steroids, the orange bars, that basically for those who are wage earners, their incomes have gone up at the top. For those at the bottom, their wages have literally gone down. A lot of that has to do with the returns to education and skill. The way I always try to get people to understand this is that I'm a professor. I make a lot more money than professors ever made, because there's a big return to being able to speak a few languages, to be technologically literate, to be able to speak in front of large crowds without getting nervous. But my dad was a janitor, and if he was alive, he would make a lot less than janitors ever made. So we've got a problem of the 1% running away from the rest. We've got a problem of the labor market shifting. We've got a problem of persistent racial disparities. And we've got a problem of rising economic uncertainty for people in these markets. And it's of two types. It's certainly for the steel workers and the coal miners that were worried about their industries leaving and voted for Donald Trump in the hope that that would be a restoration of their past. But we also have a problem with our millennials who feel so much uncertainty in the labor market. I have a son and a daughter, but my son is a musician whose backup career is as an actor. He's 31 years old. He's had several great girlfriends over the course of his life. This one we really like. We really like the last one too. But he came to talk to me when he was 26 years old about the previous girlfriend. She was 23. He said, "Dad, I got to talk to you about her. She's from an entirely different generation." And I thought, 3 years, how can that be, right? And he said, well, she came of age during the Great Recession. She never expects she's ever going to have a full-time job. So I think for a lot of the younger folks here who are feeling the pain of student debt, housing prices running away, wages that have been stagnant, uncertainty about whether or not you'll be able to stay in a career, it's interesting that the two politicians that appealed the most in 2016, really in terms of animating and energizing people, were Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders, speaking to the economic uncertainties of different generations. So we've got this uncertain economy, and we've got growing social distance. Now that social distance takes a couple of different forms, many forms, but I'm just gonna highlight a few. One is, interestingly, there's been in the last decade and a half, a sort of slight decline in residential segregation by race. For Latinos, it's gone up a bit. Some of that has to do with immigrant enclaves. But there's been increasing segregation over time by income. The rich are sorting into their own communities. Poor people are being forced into communities in which they're forced to stay. So that growing social distance by class, much like the social distance by race, sort of impedes an empathy for the other. So does this distance by class. So people who are wealthy can convince themselves that they deserve it instead of they were lucky and worked hard perhaps too, but often lucky. And people who are poor are forced into difficult conditions. The other big social distance is what we've been referring to as the racial generation gap. This is the median age by race and ethnicity of the United States. The median age, half older or half younger for non-Hispanic whites, is 43. The median age for Asian Pacific Islanders, 36. For Native Americans, African Americans, 33. For Latinos, the median age is 28. So 43, 28, that's, check your math, 15 years. It's a generation. And it helps to explain our demographic change, because when you're 28, you're in prime family formation age. When you're 43, you think you're in prime family formation age. You may be. But it also helps to explain our politics. We have an older generation looking at a younger generation and not seeing itself. And if you don't think that matters, a couple interesting statistics for you. Can you tell I like statistics? So, the state in the United States that's got the biggest racial generation gap, the widest old and the brownest young, is Arizona. With its fractious politics around immigration and ethnic studies in the schools, but also with the third largest cuts in K through 12 spending per student in the last 5 years. Another interesting statistic. You know, California, we've actually been through a lot of the demographic change the rest of the country is going through. The country's demographic change between 2000 and 2050 is California's demographic change between 1980 and 2000. And our demographic change is actually slowing down as a result. So our racial generation gap in California, do you know when it peaked? 1994 through 1998, the year of Prop 187, which was the ballot initiative that stripped all services, including education, from undocumented immigrants. In the next couple of years after that, we banned affirmative action, we banned bilingual education, and we started trying juveniles as adults. We went in the infatuation with over-incarceration. Do you know when the racial generation gap is peaking in the United States? Right now. It'll start closing, but not soon enough. So we can't wait for the demography to do the job. We need to figure out where we can get the conversation. The other thing is what my colleague Chris Benner, I'll say more about in a second, and I have been talking about, is growing epistemic distance, people not admitting to the same realities. Here on the right-hand side, you have two clear examples of that. The woman with the alternative facts and the man with the no job any longer. And we can think that that's a sort of recent phenomena, but people were talking about that in 2012 in terms of the fact wars between the Obama and Romney campaigns. Who was telling the truth? People living in very different realities. When I was young, and I once was, there were just several television stations, right? And you used to watch broadcast news. Now you watch narrowcast news, right? You watch the news that reinforces what you believe, and you get a Twitter feed that confirms everything you believe to be true. And that epistemic distance has also resulted in a kind of severe lack of faith in our institutions. A few years ago, there was a poll asking about the popularity of Congress. And by the way, the popularity of Congress has actually fallen since this poll. But they compared Congress to a bunch of different things. So for example, do you like Congress more or lice? And it turned out lice won over Congress by 67% to 20%. They then asked, do you prefer Congress or a colonoscopy? You can see that Congress went up then, but I'm convinced that's only because most young people have not actually had a colonoscopy. So we're trying to, stratify the sample by age and see what we get. Root canal. Actually, the only thing that Congress came close to being as popular as was the Canadian band Nickelback, which, if you've heard them, you would agree. So our institutions are broken. And this kind of sense of the anxiety about demographic change, the degree of economic uncertainty, the degree of sort of growing social distance, and this idea of polarization in institutions that are broken led my colleague Chris Benner and I over the last couple of years to write 2 books. Chris, can you stand up and raise your hand? There you go. That's my colleague and co-author. He wrote all the good parts. There are 2 books which wind up having a lot of the same kind of ideas. We wrote this first book, then we explored it a little bit further in the second book, Equity, Growth, and Community. And we were trying to take a look at these kind of broader crises and whether or not people were dealing with them and trying to deal with them at a metropolitan level. And we found out a couple of things that I just want to, I'm just going to say a few tantalizing things about, because really you should buy the book. And share it with your relatives and friends, put it on your bookshelf, etc. So the first thing we found out was something that is actually now being backed by more and more research, that those regions that work toward achieving equity actually do a better job of securing prosperity over the long haul. And this is not just something that we have found. It's been found by research by the Cleveland Federal Reserve and also by that well-known Marxist institution, the International Monetary Fund, which is usually kind of a big sympathetic thing around distribution. So they did a study looking at countries to try to figure out what predicted the ability to sustain a growth path. In our book, what we did was we used the IMF methodology. We looked at the top 200 metropolitan areas in the United States, and we said, what does it require for you to sustain job growth over time? Things you would think matter do: having a diversified industrial structure, having anchor institutions and universities. By the way, on the education side, the biggest thing that makes a difference is having a strong community college population, basically having the middle of the skill market filled out. But the 3 biggest impediments were the level of initial income inequality, because it made it difficult for people to coalesce on a growth strategy, the level of racial segregation, because it made it difficult for people to see in each other their own experiences and come together, and interestingly, the degree of metropolitan fragmentation, basically how many governments you have per person. And I know, some of you come from those regions where you have more governments than you have people, right? Which definitely impedes collaboration. So we then, over the course of these two books, tried to do something which is not common in social science. It should be more common. We wanted to do a bunch of qualitative case studies. And normally the way academics pick qualitative case studies is by going to Yelp reviews, right? And figuring out what would be a really pleasant place to visit, right? So we didn't choose those, although some of them were pleasant. We did a kind of data-driven exercise to figure out which places were doing better on achieving equity and growth relative to their broad census region, and then also trying to get at this, but been trying to figure out which ones were doing that and trying to come up with a mix of areas that were doing it from different, almost ideological perspectives or sort of cultural DNAs about their politics. So we've, over the course of these two books, look at 18 metropolitan areas, but I'm just going to highlight a couple of them, then I'll come back to that slide. So one we looked at was the Salt Lake metropolitan area. So a couple of things about Salt Lake which are interesting. I know that some of you might say, Salt Lake, man, they're not dealing with diversity at all. And you know, that might have been true in 1970, because I know when people think Salt Lake, they think not just white, but sort of shiny white, right? You know, kind of Book of Mormon white, right? And in 1970, Salt Lake Metro was 95% non-Hispanic white. It is slated to become majority people of color before the US does, because it's had a big influx of immigrants from Latin America, but also from Africa into the area. They've got a great system for planning called Envision Utah, which works very well in a sort of libertarian area because it's about people coming together, conversing, and finding agreements where they can. There's a thing in Utah that's called the Utah Compact, which is an agreement amongst business leaders, civic leaders, and immigrant rights leaders to speak civilly about immigration issues. Utah had driver's licenses for undocumented immigrants 12 years before progressive California. It had tuition, in-state tuition for undocumented kids only 1 year after California. So conversations made that happen. Another place that's actually done a pretty good job from a sort of red perspective, Oklahoma City, which has had the MAPS project, trying to put investments into the center of its metropolitan area, partly because they had a big shock when United Airlines did not want to locate a facility there, because the executives visited Oklahoma City and said, this place sucks. No one would want to live here. We can't figure out how we get executives to come here. And they realized that it wasn't just about the tax deal, because they were offering the best tax subsidy of anyone, that they had to improve the quality of life in their city. And in order to do that, they needed to reinvest in a tattered downtown that they let go. And in order to do that, they needed to build a political consensus with all sorts of populations. So they rolled out this MAPS project, the second of which was focused on education. Oklahoma City has done a much better job on closing the achievement gap between black and white students than almost any metropolitan area. And the head of the Oklahoma Chamber of Commerce is a leader in de-incarceration and re-entry into the labor market, try to reduce the prison population in Oklahoma. So that came out of a set of conversations. In Seattle, a lot of focus on race and equity. Seattle has a thing that's called the Seattle process, also known as talking things to death. But what the Seattle process does is it's sort of in the cultural DNA of kind of talking about issues and trying to come up to solutions. So for example, when Seattle raised its minimum wage, they did it through a collaborative process, which involved business, labor, all sorts of different constituencies, and they came up with the path to 15 in a way that certainly reflected tensions, but also reflected this infamous Seattle process. Last example, kind of another blue area and a different one, it makes an important point, is San Antonio, Texas. We like to talk about San Antonio for a number of different reasons, but the biggest one is that they did this kind of, if you go to San Antonio now and you talk to people, everybody on the tip of their tongue is the word collaboration. We collaborate, we collaborate, we collaborate. So they managed to get a Sustainable Communities Initiative, a Promise Zone, a Promise Neighborhood, right? They got a bunch of other grants from the federal government based on their level of collaboration. 2012, the voters in San Antonio passed a tax on themselves, sales tax on themselves, to fund universal pre-K with the rollout targeted initially at disadvantaged kids. So that's a big thing to have happen. And it was, of course, supported by the mayor and a bunch of community groups, but it was also supported by the San Antonio Chamber of Commerce on the grounds that this was an investment in the workforce of the future for 20 years from now. Sounds like a great story. If you had gone to San Antonio 40 years ago, you would have found the west side of San Antonio was basically without infrastructure and flooding all the time. The east side of San Antonio, largely African-American area, disenfranchised politically. There was an at-large election system that meant that brown and black people couldn't get their representatives on the council except for 2 token seats that were there. And there was a great community-based organization, COPS, Community Organized for Public Service, that basically really raised the stink. They went and challenged the largest banker in town by going into his bank and sending people in to change dollars into pennies, and then they would go out and come back in and change pennies into dollars, right? Jamming up his business till he backed down on a particular thing. They found out a secret plan of the Chamber of Commerce to try to market San Antonio as a low-wage area, and they exposed that plan as basically a pathway to poverty. The road to equity involves some level of discomfort. The road to equity involves some level of conflict. If you are collaborating and there's no conflict, that just means you're hanging out with your friends. Collaboration is principled conflict. It's about getting together with people with whom you have some conflicts, having some principles about how you would conflict with integrity and a willingness to come back again. But if equity is going to get on the table, if race is going to get on the table, it's going to come with some tough conversations and sometimes some tough language. And this is, I think, the message, I guess, that I'll just sort of leave you with then. In moving forward, and I will have a little bit of Q&A to talk about this, I am not so hopeful about the nation, but I am so hopeful about our metropolitan areas. It seems to me in our metropolitan areas, people are forced to come together face to face, race to race, place to place. And in doing that, they wind up having to have the kind of dialogues that seem to escape us at a national level. As you do that, as you build out these conversations and collaborations, be sure to stress that equity and inclusion are not something that you kind of add on afterwards, like let's recuperate the economy and then we'll worry about who we mold in the process. Let's recuperate our downtown and never have in plan a place for displacement, anti-gentrification. Try to make sure that equity is baked in, not sprinkled on. Second big thing is, as mentioned by others, is to try to bring together unusual partners across sectors and silos, people you might not normally agree with, and try to see whether agreements can be forged. But then I want to just echo something, and then I guess I'll close with something that Glenn said, quoting our friend Darren from the Ford Foundation. These are turbulent times, and it's going to require that we get comfortable with being uncomfortable. There are people who come home every day, kids who come home every day worried about whether or not their parents will be deported. There are young folks walking home from school worried whether or not they'll be stopped and criminalized by a police officer. There are people living paycheck to paycheck. Apparently, about half the nation has about $500 in their bank account to weather any kind of emergency. Raising those issues, getting them squarely on the table, talking forthrightly about race, talking forthrightly about the disaster that this tax bill will be, talking forthrightly about the undercurrent of racism that has been gone from dog whistle to bullhorn. Get comfortable with being uncomfortable, because a lot of people are uncomfortable on a daily basis about the realities that they face. And if we, in a banquet hall, in a lovely hotel, in the boutique city of San Francisco, cannot feel ourselves getting discomfortable about those realities, uncomfortable about those realities, then we don't have any right to call ourselves leaders in this American moment. Thank you.